Alexandria, a gateway to knowledge, stories, and imagination, a digital library without limits, always open, always growing. Subscribe, like, and be part of the journey of discovery.
Chapter 1. The Frankish Emperor. Charlemagne often gathered his officials at his palace in Ingelheim, where he governed his lands. In 1807, an obelisk was erected on a nearby hill with the inscription, Charlemagne's Highway. He chose this location for his palace, appreciating its natural beauty. From these hills, there is an incredible view of the Rhine, Johannesburg, and the Rheingau, stretching across a lush, fertile valley. One description from the time notes that Charlemagne was the first Frankish ruler to build on a grand scale. It states, a great admirer of Greek and Roman architecture, Charlemagne rejected the simplicity of his ancestors. He aimed to blend utility with beauty and comfort with artistry. He built not just as a landowner, but as a king. He chose one of the most beautiful spots on the Rheingau Heights for the Ingelheim Palace. From here, you can see the broad river, dotted with islands, flowing from its bend at Mainz to where it plunges into the dark depths of Bingerloch. The smiling meadows along its banks, at the base of vine-covered hills, unfold like a charming panorama. Contemporary accounts describe the palace as a marvel of art, as if it had been magically transported from Ravenna, in Italy, to the banks of the Rhine. Charlemagne obtained the palace's marble and granite columns and its interior decorations with the Pope's help. While other rulers from barbarian tribes often built lavishly, displaying wealth by covering their buildings in large amounts of gold and silver, Charlemagne took a different approach. He did not use gold and silver excessively for mere decoration. Instead, he used these precious metals more sparingly and tastefully to add beauty to his palace at Ingelheim. This palace was a careful and artistic reproduction of an ancient palace in Ravenna, Italy, built on the scenic heights of Ingelheim. This marked a significant shift in style, showing how the residence, and eventually the title and authority of the Caesars, passed into the hands of a German ruler. There are also detailed descriptions of Charlemagne himself from that time. According to Eginhard's chronicles, he was tall and well-proportioned, standing about 7 feet high, with bright eyes, a strong nose, beautiful hair, and an open, honest expression. Whether seated or standing, he commanded respect through his dignity. Charlemagne was frequently on horseback, whether in war or on the hunt. He was as passionate about swimming as he was about hunting, often diving into the green waves of the Rhine with his strong arms. But he preferred the warm mineral baths of Aachen over river water. According to the chronicles of Eginhard, Charlemagne typically wore traditional Frankish clothing, which is described in detail in a chronicle from St. Gall. The Frankish outfit included shoes adorned with gold, fastened with scarlet bands around the legs, and stockings of the same color, made of fine flax with intricate patterns. Next came an inner coat made from bright canvas material, a shoulder belt, and a sword. The final piece of the attire was a gray or blue four-cornered cloak, doubled over so that when draped over the shoulder, it hung down to the feet in the front and back, but barely covered the knees on the sides. In his right hand, he carried a staff made from a young tree with symmetrical knobs and a handle of finely crafted gold or silver. This staff was both beautiful and formidable. The cloak itself was made of a thick woolen fabric known as Frisian, produced in the northern Netherlands. This was Charlemagne's usual attire. However, in winter, he wore an additional outer garment made from otter and marten furs to keep his shoulders and chest warm. He disliked foreign styles of clothing and only wore them once or twice when in Rome, and only at the request of the Pope. He always carried a sword at his side, with a golden hilt and belt. Occasionally he would use a sword set with jewels, but only for special ceremonies or when receiving important visitors. During major festivals, Charlemagne would wear a gold-embroidered outfit, shoes adorned with gems, a cloak fastened with a gold clasp, and a jeweled gold crown. Another account from Charlemagne's time provides further details of his appearance and clothing. Although the Franks were skilled riders and usually fought on horseback, they did not participate in tournaments. Instead, their focus was on religious and state festivals, which were their grandest events. These festivals allowed them to display their love for splendor and ceremonial grandeur. Charlemagne often invited representatives from distant lands to attend these state festivals. At these gatherings, the king sat on a high, magnificent throne, draped in a blue cloak and wearing a radiant crown. In his right hand, he held a golden scepter. His wife wore a crown over her veil, and her dress, like those of the court ladies, sparkled with pearls, rubies, diamonds, and other precious gems, either acquired through trade or taken as war spoils. The dukes, counts, and other nobles around the throne wore belts adorned with gold, silver, and jewels from the East. Their fur-trimmed cloaks reflected the traditions of their ancestors and their experiences in the forests. Palace officials stood behind the emperor. Heralds tossed gold coins to the crowd, and musicians and poets celebrated the Frankish heroes with songs and recitations. These festivals could last for several days. At the sound of a horn, guests would mount their horses to hunt boars and buffaloes, which were common at that time. This hunt required boldness, as it was very dangerous. For a less intense pastime, they fished and hunted with falcons and other birds of prey. Other popular activities included ball games and chess tournaments. During Charlemagne's reign, the Franks were very enthusiastic about both, but the emperor himself had little interest in such games. While Charlemagne viewed chess as an enjoyable pastime, he deemed the time too valuable to devote to such diversions. Meals in wealthy households typically had 3 courses, a salad of mallows or hops to stimulate the appetite and aid digestion, plain bread served with pork or venison, and pastries and fruit for dessert. Wine was rarely consumed, so there were few instances of excessive behavior. Common drinks include beer and mead. Poorer families and those of modest means ate simpler meals of turnips, lentils, beans, and other vegetables. On special occasions, they might enjoy a goose and some type of pastry. Regardless of wealth or social status, great importance was placed on hair and beards, which were seen as symbols of strength and courage, qualities that were highly respected at that time. Exchanging a lock of hair could signify a mutual agreement, and a promise might be sealed by touching another's beard. A debtor who couldn't repay his debt would offer shears to his creditor to cut his beard, indicating his submission. If a young warrior was captured by barbarians and sentenced to death, he would beg his captors not to stain his hair with blood or allow a slave to touch it. Agreements were sometimes broken by snapping a straw. Hospitality was considered a sacred duty, and guests were treated with great respect and care. The furniture in homes was simple. The walls were covered with painted and gilded leather, and the floors with straw mats woven by the women of the house. Except on festival days, when elaborate displays were expected, life at both the court of Charlemagne and in private homes was marked by simplicity. Charlemagne's wife and daughters were actively involved in managing the household. The daughters learned to spin and weave from a young age, and Charlemagne preferred to wear the clothes they made. Angilbert, a learned friend of the emperor, described the palace at Ingelheim and a hunting party involving Charlemagne's wife, Lindgard, and his sons, Karl and Pepin. Lindgard, the emperor's lovely wife, entered the courtyard with a large entourage. Her cheeks were as rosy as the flowers, and her hair shone like a purple robe. She wore a purple band on her forehead. Jewels sparkled on her neck, and a golden crown glimmered on her head. As she entered with her ladies, the courtiers stepped aside to make way. She mounted her horse with royal grace, surrounded by nobles and her two sons, Karl and Pepin. Karl, who shares his father's name, looked very much like him in appearance, stature, and spirit. Dressed in full armor, he was a brave and proven warrior. After the queen and princes, the hunters moved through the gates, accompanied by the sounds of hounds and horns. Next came the princesses with their attendants. Rotrud led the group, her face calm and her posture proud. Her blonde hair was tied back with a purple ribbon, and a small gold crown rested on her forehead. Bertha followed, who resembled her father in looks, voice, and temperament. Her blonde hair was braided with gold cords and crowned with a diadem. A marten fur draped her neck, and jewels adorned the seams of her fitted cloak. Then came Gisela, radiant and beautiful, with a veil woven with purple threads. Her hands shone like silver, her brows like gold, and her eyes sparkled like the sun as she expertly guided her spirited horse. Behind her was Rodhide on a gracefully trotting horse, adorned with jeweled decorations on her hair, neck, and feet, and a silk cloak fastened with golden clasps. Theodora followed, with a rosy complexion and golden red hair, wearing an emerald necklace and a magnificent cloak. Finally, Hiltrud appeared. She glanced around with a regal air before turning her horse toward the forest, which promised adventure for this impressive group. But where was Charlemagne, the ruler of the household and the empire, as the hunting party set off? Was he watching the lively scene from the palace balcony, or was he in his private chamber, grappling with the serious issues that would determine the fate of his empire? These issues were no small matter. Charlemagne had inherited not just power and honor, but also great burdens that required immense strength to manage. His life was a constant battle against forces that threatened his empire. To understand his situation, we need to look back at the challenges he faced when he became king of the Franks. By reviewing the history of the empire up to his reign, we can better appreciate what this great leader had to confront and achieve.
Hello. If you enjoyed our audiobook, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I need your support to bring more audiobooks to you. Thank you in advance for your support.
Chapter 2. From Pagan Warriors to Christian Kings. By the middle of the 5th century, around 300 years before Charlemagne, the Franks, who lived on both sides of the Rhine River, had become one of the most powerful Germanic tribes. They invaded Gaul from the north, conquering areas controlled by the Alemanni and Burgundians, and settled firmly in the eastern and southeastern regions. Meanwhile, the West Goths controlled southern Gaul. During this time, a leader named Clovis emerged among the Franks. Clovis was known for his extreme bravery, but was also ruthless and unprincipled. He ruled over one of the Frankish clans, while his relatives led the others. The Franks traced their ancestry to Meroveus, from whom the ruling Merovingian dynasty got its name. Despite being related, the Frankish chiefs were often at war with each other. Clovis eventually managed to assert a form of authority over all the clans and compelled his relatives to provide him with soldiers. With this achieved, he worked to consolidate his power and end the internal conflicts among the Franks, intending to use their united strength for further conquests in Gaul. At that time, a small part of Gaul, located between the Seine and Loire rivers, remained politically independent under Roman rule. This region was governed by a Roman patrician named Syagrius. Clovis aimed his next campaign at this area, provoking Syagrius into a war. Clovis defeated him in battle and forced Alaric II, the king of the West Goths, who had given Syagrius refuge, to surrender him. Syagrius was then strangled in prison by Clovis. Clovis then turned his attention to the Burgundians, who occupied southeastern Gaul and were ruled by two brothers, Gundobald and Godegisel. Both brothers were ultimately killed by Clovis's actions. After their deaths, Clovis sought to marry their niece, Clotilde. Her uncle, now the Burgundian chief, was too intimidated to refuse Clovis's proposal. Clotilde, who was a Christian, became his wife and tried to convert him to Christianity. But Clovis was more interested in securing her family's inheritance than her religious beliefs. Before he could finalize his plans with the Burgundians, Clovis faced another challenge. The Alemanni tribe was threatening his relative, Sigebert. This gave Clovis a reason to go to war with them. A decisive battle took place at Toul. It was a fierce and bloody battle, and initially, the Alemanni seemed to be winning. Remembering Clotilde's efforts to convert him, Clovis prayed to the Christian God in front of his entire army, promising to convert to Christianity if he won the battle. After this, he regrouped his forces and launched a powerful attack on the Alemanni, overwhelming them. The Alemanni were devastated, and Clovis took control of the entire region between the Neckar and Lahn rivers, forcing the local population to provide soldiers to replenish his army. Later that year, Clovis and 3,000 of his soldiers were baptized in Reims, marking his conversion to Christianity. Earlier, some Germanic chiefs who converted to Christianity had followed the Arian branch of the faith, but Clovis chose to adopt Catholicism. His conversion was celebrated in Rome, and the Pope granted him the title of All-Christian King, a title that would also be passed down to his Frankish successors. Later, the clergy spread a story claiming that a miracle occurred during Clovis's baptism. According to this tale, there was no consecrated oil available for the ceremony. As the bishop stood helpless at the altar, a white dove suddenly appeared, carrying a flask of oil in its beak. This was seen as a sign that Clovis's name was written in heaven, and that his conversion had pleased God and the angels. To convince skeptics, the miraculous flask was preserved in the Cathedral of Reims, and it was said that its contents never ran out, even though it was used for every baptism and coronation until the end of the last century. The story of its miraculous origin spread and is still believed by some today. Despite his baptism, anointing, and papal titles, Clovis remained deceitful, aggressive, and bloodthirsty. He next turned against his wife's Burgundian relatives, subjugating them and forcing them to pay tribute to him. Clovis now controlled most of Gaul, including the southern part, which had previously belonged to the West Goths. A century earlier, under the leadership of Ataulf, the West Goths had taken control of areas north and south of the Pyrenees, covering southern Gaul and northern Spain. Clovis did not have a political reason to wage war against the West Goths, so he used a religious one. As the all-Christian king, Clovis gathered the bishops and secular leaders and declared, "Shall we allow the heretical West Goths to occupy that beautiful land and persecute our Catholic brothers? Rise up in the name of our faith and conquer them." Clovis had openly declared his loyalty to the Catholic faith, which led to renewed celebrations in Rome when it was learned that he had launched a crusade against the West Goths. He defeated Alaric II in battle killing him with his own hands. However, he was prevented from conquering the entire West Gothic kingdom by Theodoric the Great, Alaric's father-in-law. As a result, Clovis had to be satisfied with gaining control over the territory between the Loire and Garonne rivers as part of the Frankish Empire. Clovis's reign was characterized by constant injustice, cruelty, and violence. One act of brutality quickly followed another. He next sought to seize the lands of his Frankish relatives. Sigebert, who had fought alongside him against the Alemanni, was left crippled by a wound he received in the Battle of Toul. Clovis sent a message to Sigbert's son, suggesting that his father had lived long enough and that they could be friends if his father were no longer in the picture. The son, who was morally corrupt, murdered his father and sent a message to Clovis saying, "My father is no longer alive. Send your men, and they can take whatever they need from my treasures." Clovis sent his men, but with a different mission. When the young prince led them to the treasure chamber, they killed him there. Clovis then positioned himself as the avenger of Frankish chiefs who had been killed by Sigebert. He called together the heads of the Frankish families and persuaded them to accept his authority and recognize his rule. When one relative proved too stubborn to submit, Clovis secretly incited a rebellion against him. Once the man was captured by his people and brought before Clovis in chains, Clovis mocked him, saying, "How dare you present yourself before me in such a disgraceful manner, shackled like a common criminal? Your appearance in chains not only dishonors you, but also casts a shadow of shame upon our entire noble lineage. Have you no regard for the dignity and reputation of our family? Your actions have brought nothing but disgrace to our proud name, and I find your lack of consideration for our ancestral legacy utterly reprehensible." With that, he struck him down with a battle axe. He also killed the man's brother when he protested. Eventually, all his relatives who hesitated in showing loyalty faced his wrath. Clovis then became paranoid, fearing that some family members might have been overlooked. He hypocritically lamented that he had no relative he could trust. He ordered a search, but no survivors were found. He now had uncontested control over a kingdom stretching from the mouth of the Rhine to Switzerland in the south, to the Atlantic Ocean in the west, and almost to the Pyrenees in the southwest. He believed he was secure from all enemies, but in his 44th year, death claimed him. His kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, but the following 2 centuries were filled with constant conflict among them and their descendants. Treachery, assassination, and poisoning were common tactics used by the male members of the royal family to achieve their goals. Meanwhile, jealousy, envy, and revenge drove their wives to commit terrible crimes. The simplicity of life at court disappeared, replaced by the corruption of Roman civilization, which ultimately led to the decline of the once proud Merovingian dynasty, weakened both physically and morally. As a result of the declining power of the Merovingian kings, by the end of the 6th century, they had handed over the responsibilities of ruling to the mayors of the palace. One of the most notable of these mayors was Pepin of Landen, who founded the Pepin family, later known as the Carolingians. It was largely thanks to this powerful family that the Frankish kingdom, which included Burgundy and Thuringia, avoided collapse. Later, another member of this family, Pepin of Heristal, rose to prominence as a leader. After his many significant achievements, his son, Charles, better known as Charles Martel, or the Hammer, for his victory over the Moors in 732, succeeded him. Charles Martel is credited with saving both the Frankish kingdom and the Christian world in Germany from a major threat by defeating the Moors, who had overthrown the West Goths in Spain in 711 and established their rule there. Charles Martel's successor was another Pepin, known as Pepin the Short, due to his height. Pepin the Short was a powerful ruler, particularly against enemies like the Saxons. The Franks and Saxons had a long history of hostility, marked by numerous fierce battles. It is unclear who was initially at fault, but it is evident that after the Franks converted to Christianity, the Saxons frequently invaded Frankish territory. Thus, the wars Pepin fought against them were considered justified to some extent. Eventually, he defeated the Saxons and forced them to pay tribute. During Pepin's reign, the old royal system of government was restored, but he also ensured that the influence of the church remained strong. To achieve this, he sought the support of the bishops in the kingdom. His efforts were so successful that 2 bishops agreed to negotiate with the Pope on his behalf. At the same time, the Pope was under threat from the Lombard king Haistulf and needed help. With the bishop's support, Pepin forced Haistulf to surrender his lands to the Pope, who then recognized the Franks as defenders of the church. Pepin the Short, like his predecessors, Charles Martel, Pepin of Heristal, and Pepin of Landen, achieved significant successes for the Frankish kingdom. He waged a long war with Aquitaine and ultimately added it to his territories. When the Saxons hesitated to continue paying the tribute his father had imposed, he used force to make them comply. As his death approached, Pepin divided his kingdom between his 2 sons, Charles, later known as Charlemagne, and Carloman. Charles received Aquitaine, Austrasia, Thuringia, Bavaria, Mainz, and Worms, while Carloman inherited Burgundy, Alsace, Provence, and Alemannia. Neustria was split equally between them. Pepin died in 768. Chapter 3. The End of the Lombard Kingdom. Charlemagne was born in Aix-la-Chapelle in 742 and became a ruler at the age of 26. His brother, Carloman, died 3 years into his reign, leaving Charlemagne as the sole ruler of the entire kingdom. Remarkably, Charlemagne only experienced 1 year of peace during his 46 years of rule. In the political world of that era, the dominant strategy was hammer and anvil, meaning there was no option for peaceful coexistence with neighbors. It was either to oppress or be oppressed. No middle ground existed. To understand Charlemagne's campaign against Desiderius, king of the Lombards, we first need to look at his relationship with his brother, Carloman. As mentioned, Carloman passed away 3 years into his reign. When their father, Pepin, divided the kingdom between Charlemagne and Carloman, it needed the approval of the Frankish nobles to be valid. Pepin had specified that, although his 2 sons would each be granted authority, the Frankish kingdom was to remain united, with only its administration split between them. The brothers respected Pepin's wishes, and efforts were made to keep the kingdom unified. However, soon after they took power, an event tested their commitment to this arrangement. Wulf, the leader of the southwestern Frankish duchy, initiated a rebellion, thinking he could achieve what his predecessor, Waisar, had failed to do while Pepin was alive. Charlemagne quickly prepared to suppress the rebellion and called on Carloman to help. Carloman refused, forcing Charlemagne to act alone, but he swiftly crushed the uprising. This led to anger among Charlemagne and his supporters, not just within his domain, but also in Carloman's, with many feeling Charlemagne should have been the sole ruler. Carloman's refusal was seen as a betrayal, not only of his brother, but also of the United Kingdom. Many believed that only Charlemagne's strength could prevent the negative consequences of Carloman's actions. Some of Charlemagne's key warriors had even favored marching against Wulf without waiting for Carloman's support. It was thanks to their mother Bertha, a respected royal widow, known affectionately in later legends as the Swan Maiden, that a civil war between the brothers was avoided. Charlemagne had a deep affection for his mother, and she was determined to reconcile him with Carloman. She managed to ease the tensions between them, but soon after, Carloman died. Following his death, the leading nobles and church leaders gathered and declared Charlemagne the ruler of the entire Frankish kingdom. They recognized the danger of a divided kingdom and acted quickly to prevent it. After Carloman's death, his widow, Gilberga, could have sought protection from Charlemagne and her mother-in-law, Bertha. Instead, she was persuaded by Charlemagne's enemies to leave the country, planning to claim her two sons' rights when the opportunity arose. She soon aligned herself with Desiderius, the king of the Lombards, who harbored a deep resentment against the Franks. Desiderius's hostility stemmed from the actions of Pepin, Charlemagne's father, who had forced Desiderius's predecessor, King Haistulf, to relinquish control of Rome and other territories to the papacy after threatening Rome and seizing Ravenna. Desiderius, viewing himself as Haistulf's heir and avenger, never forgot this and regularly involved himself in Roman affairs. Following the death of Pope Paul I in Rome, a layman named Constantine became pope. Christoph and Sergius, leaders of the opposing faction, sought help from Desiderius, who saw an opportunity to benefit himself. He quickly responded, deposing Constantine, imprisoning him, and having him blinded. Desiderius then decided to install a Lombard as pope and instructed two Lombard priests, Waldebert and Philip, to build a faction in Rome that would elect Philip as the new pope. Christoph and Sergius soon regretted asking Desiderius for help, but they managed to remove the two Lombard priests during an uprising. Philip and his assistant fled to a church seeking asylum, but their enemies did not honor this. Philip was imprisoned in a monastery, and Waldebert, who was clinging to an image of the Virgin Mary, was forcibly removed and blinded. Christoph and Sergius succeeded in electing a Roman as pope, who took the name Stephen III. However, when Stephen did not govern in a way that suited them, they decided to remove him by force. Fearing for his safety, Stephen appealed to Desiderius, who once again saw an opportunity to serve his interests. Desiderius offered Stephen his support, and the Pope wrote letters to Charlemagne and his mother, praising Desiderius's actions in Rome. Desiderius then attacked Christoph and Sergius, who had gathered a sizable force, defeated them, captured them, and had them blinded. Pope Stephen III now found himself at the mercy of Desiderius, who pressured him relentlessly to hand over the territories that Pepin had previously restored to the church. This intensified Charlemagne's resentment toward Desiderius. Charlemagne was ready to intervene as soon as Stephen asked for help. However, his plans were disrupted by an unexpected move he couldn't ignore. His mother, Bertha, who had traveled to Italy, intervened. She wrote letters that encouraged a more diplomatic approach rather than a military one. Although Bertha did not doubt her son's courage or the strength of his army, she was deeply concerned about the potential dangers of a conflict between the Franks and the Lombards. With her wisdom and experience, she understood the complexities of the situation. She knew that Duke Tassilo of Bavaria, her late husband's nephew, who had been essential in helping Charlemagne secure his rule, was just as hostile toward him as Desiderius was. Tassilo had betrayed Pepin by refusing to provide support during the war against Waisar, Wulf's predecessor. Bertha knew that Pepin had planned to punish Tassilo for his betrayal, but his death prevented it. Now that Tassilo and Desiderius were on friendly terms, she worried that if Charlemagne attacked one of them, the other might come to his aid. Moreover, the Saxons, located to the north of the Frankish kingdom, were once again preparing for war. Bertha also feared that the West Frankish duchy might rise in rebellion if a conflict broke out. Finally, she was aware that Desiderius had promised Carloman's widow and sons that he would stir up a revolt in their favor within the Frankish kingdom. To prevent these threats, Bertha devised a plan to establish a three-way alliance between Desiderius, Tassilo, and Charlemagne. She proposed that Charlemagne and Tassilo each marry a daughter of Desiderius, while Adalgus, Desiderius's only son, would marry Gisela, Charlemagne's sister. The plan was agreed upon by everyone involved, except for Gisela. She chose to enter a convent and devote herself to religious life rather than becoming a queen. Today she is honored in the Catholic Church under the name Etisburg. The daughter of Desiderius, chosen by Bertha as a bride for Charlemagne, was named Desiderata. She was described as a princess with a beautiful face and a dignified presence. Bertha introduced Desiderata to Charlemagne, who had recently separated from his first wife, the daughter of a Frankish nobleman. At that time, separations and remarriages were common among the upper classes, and some of the highest-ranking individuals even had multiple wives. Bertha arranged the marriage in secret, and the Pope did not learn of her plans until Desiderata had already arrived in the Frankish kingdom. It is no surprise that this news caused the Pope great concern. He clearly understood that if Charlemagne married Desiderata and became Desiderius's son-in-law, he would likely stop supporting the Church's control over the territories that Pepin had taken from the Lombards and given to Rome. The Pope sent an urgent letter to Charlemagne, pleading with him to break off the marriage. He went so far as to describe the Lombards, who had been living among the Romans, as little better than carrion and descendants of lepers. He concluded with a stern warning. We send you this appeal from the grave of St. Peter, with our tears. If you, though we cannot imagine it, defy the authority of Peter, our master, you will be excommunicated. You will be banished from God's kingdom eternally, condemned to be with the devil and the wicked in the everlasting fires of hell. By the time Charlemagne received this letter, the wedding celebrations were already over, and the Pope's warning came too late. Whether this letter would have changed Bertha's plans is uncertain, but it did intensify Charlemagne's initial dislike of Desiderata. Not long after, Charlemagne found her presence so intolerable that he sent her back to her father, Desiderius. This decision undermined all of his mother's efforts to create peace through this marriage alliance. Desiderius was furious with both Charlemagne and the Pope, blaming the Pope most for the insult to his daughter. In his anger, he demanded that the Pope crown Carloman's son as king of the Franks, planning to use this as a way to spark a revolt in the Frankish kingdom in the boy's favor. The timing seemed perfect, since Charlemagne was currently engaged in a war with the Saxons. While the Pope hesitated, and just as Desiderius was about to use force, Pope Stephen died, and Hadrian became his successor. Pope Hadrian refused to crown Carloman's son as king, despite Desiderius's attempts to persuade him with both flattery and threats. In response, Desiderius began attacking papal territories and moved to besiege Rome. With all land routes blocked by Desiderius, Hadrian sent messengers by sea to Marseille and then to Diedenhofen, where Charlemagne's court was located at that time. In his letter, Hadrian informed Charlemagne of Desiderius's demands and aggressive actions and begged him not to let him fall into Desiderius's hands. Shortly after receiving Hadrian's plea, Charlemagne received a letter from Desiderius. Trying to buy time for his plans against Rome, Desiderius falsely claimed that he had returned all the territories to the Pope that were rightfully his. Charlemagne was not fooled. He knew that Desiderius's support for Carloman's son was a clear sign of hostility toward him. Charlemagne decided to go to war against the Lombards immediately, and the campaign began in the autumn of 773. Charlemagne gathered his forces in Geneva. The Frankish soldiers were equipped differently than in the past. They now carried the longer Roman spear and larger shield, which provided better protection than the traditional round Frankish shield. Instead of the old leather head coverings, they wore bronze helmets with visors. Their bodies were protected by coats of mail. Many soldiers also carried heavy clubs instead of long swords. These clubs were made of knotted oak, reinforced with iron, and some were made entirely of metal, making them formidable weapons. Following the advice of the Franks who were hostile to Charlemagne and had been welcomed at Desiderius's court, the Lombards blocked and heavily guarded the Alpine passes leading into Lombardy. Desiderius felt confident that this would be enough to keep Charlemagne at bay. His confidence grew even more when Charlemagne, out of consideration for Desiderius's natural anger over his daughter's humiliation, tried once more to make peace. Charlemagne asked Desiderius to accept Pepin's previous decision to grant territory to the church and to refrain from attacking his rule. However, Desiderius misinterpreted this gesture as a sign that Charlemagne felt invading Italy was impossible. He arrogantly rejected the offer and became so insolent that Charlemagne, realizing war was now inevitable, remarked, "He does not fear the barking of the German dog, so long as it does not come out of its kennel." Charlemagne made thorough preparations for any scenario. As soon as he received Desiderius's response, he moved his forces forward. He led the main part of his army over Mont Cenis, a route Desiderius had thought impassable, while his uncle Bernhard took another division across Mount Jol. The two divisions met at the southern base of the Alps, encountering resistance only at one point, which they quickly overcame. Without hesitation, Charlemagne advanced and defeated the Lombard forces, led by Adalgis and the Frankish leader Ottokar. He then moved on to lay siege to Pavia, where Ottokar had fled to join Desiderius. Anticipating a potentially long siege, Charlemagne led a division of his army toward Rome, capturing several Roman cities that had been taken by the Lombards along the way. As Charlemagne's victorious march continued, there was great celebration in Rome and deep fear among the Lombards. The Romans eagerly prepared to welcome their rescuer. Historian Ozanam describes the scene. On Easter Saturday, Charlemagne arrived at the gates of Rome. The clergy holding crosses, the senators and magistrates waving banners, and children carrying palm branches while singing hymns, went out to greet him. He proceeded to the Vatican, where Pope Hadrian awaited him. The next day, he donned the tunic and laticlave and presided over the court of justice, exercising both military authority and civil jurisdiction as a patrician. Shortly afterward, Charlemagne set out for his uncle's camp near Pavia, where Desiderius was besieged. The Chronicles of St. Gall describe Charlemagne's arrival. From a high tower, Desiderius and Ottokar watched as Charlemagne's army approached from a distance. Initially, they saw only the war machines. Desiderius asked, "Is Charlemagne with this great army?" Ottokar replied that he was not. But when Desiderius saw a large force of warriors following, he said, "Surely Charlemagne must be among that vast throng of warriors." Ottokar answered, "No, it shouldn't be there yet. What's there to be so worried about? Have you lost your confidence?" Growing more anxious, Desiderius asked, "What shall become of us if he arrives with an even more formidable army? The very thought chills me to the bone. How can we possibly hope to withstand such overwhelming force? Our defenses, which once seemed so impregnable, now appear as fragile as autumn leaves before a storm. Perhaps we should consider negotiation before it's too late, lest we face utter annihilation at the hands of this seemingly invincible foe." As he spoke, the bodyguards appeared. Desiderius, now panicking, cried out, "Charlemagne must be there. Oh no, he's coming with a huge army." But Ottokar again assured him that Charlemagne was not there. Then came the bishops, abbots, clergy of the royal chapel, and noblemen. Desiderius groaned, "Let us hide deep in the earth, far from the sight of this fearsome enemy." Just as he finished speaking, they saw what looked like a dark cloud in the west, driven by a northeast wind. The glint of weapons signaled a day as dark as night for the doomed city. Then Charlemagne himself appeared, an imposing figure in iron armor, iron helmet and gauntlets, a coat of iron mail covering his chest and shoulders, a lance raised in his right hand, and his left gripping the hilt of his sword. Famine and disease eventually forced the city to surrender. Desiderius was dethroned, his rule declared ended, and he was initially sent to Liège, Lüttich, and later to the monastery of Corvey, where he spent the rest of his life in penance. His son, Adalgis, managed to avoid a similar fate by fleeing. After the city surrendered, the Archbishop of Milan crowned Charlemagne with the Iron Crown, named for a nail from the cross that, according to tradition, had been brought from Jerusalem by Empress Helena and set among the crown's jewels. Right after his coronation, Paulus Diaconus, a renowned historian, attempted to stir up a revolt. He was arrested, brought before a military court, and sentenced to a dishonorable death. However, Charlemagne chose not to carry out the execution. Admiring Paulus for his patriotism, Charlemagne granted him his freedom instead. He then established a new constitution and laws for the Lombards. Once the affairs of their kingdom were settled, Charlemagne received word of a Saxon uprising. Chapter 4. The War Against the Saxons. Now we turn to Charlemagne's longest and most difficult conflict, the war against the Saxons, which began before his campaign against Desiderius and lasted for 33 years. There had long been a deep-seated hostility between the Franks and the Saxons. The Saxons had been previously subdued by Charlemagne's predecessors and forced to pay tribute. Saxony stretched along both sides of the Weser River, extending west to the Lower Rhine, southwest to the Harz Mountains and the Unstrut River, and north to the sea, except for the area occupied by the Frisians. Saxony was home to 4 groups: the Westphalians, who lived between the Weser and Issel rivers; the Eastphalians, on the right bank of the Weser, to the Elbe River; the Engern, who lived between these 2 groups; and the Northmen, or Nordalbingians, who lived on both sides of the Elbe. The term Pfalen, or Pfalen, means Great Plain, and the name Westphalia is still used today. The Saxons were not very advanced in terms of civilization. Their hatred for the Germanic peoples who had converted to Christianity, due to the efforts of Boniface and other missionaries, led them to sever ties with their former allies. They continued to worship Odin and other pagan gods in their forests, as they had done in ancient times. Charlemagne's campaign against the Saxons was motivated not only by religious reasons, but also by the need to neutralize a dangerous neighbor before turning his attention to Italy to conquer Desiderius. He invaded Saxony and captured Eresburg, near which stood the Irminsul, a sacred idol revered by the Saxons. The meaning of the Irminsul is still debated. Some believe it symbolized the world ash tree, Yggdrasil, whose trunk was thought to be rooted in the underworld, with its branches reaching Odin's palace Valhalla. Others think it was a memorial to Arminius, who had liberated Germany from Roman rule. The Franks destroyed the Irminsul, and the Saxons finally sued for peace, which Charlemagne granted after they provided 12 hostages. He then withdrew his army. Following this initial victory over the Saxons, Charlemagne launched his campaign against Desiderius. But shortly after deposing the Lombard king, he received news that the Saxons, breaking their promise to remain peaceful, had invaded Hesse and were ravaging the land. Charlemagne swiftly returned and confronted them with such force that they were easily defeated again. They submitted once more, sent hostages, and were pardoned. However, Charlemagne did not enjoy peace for long. An uprising led by Adalgis, the son of Desiderius, who had previously escaped, broke out in Italy. Adalgis sought help from the Greek emperor and allied with his brother-in-law, Arighis, Duke of Benevento, who had married the rejected Desiderata. This alliance also brought support from other Italian nobles, who had been allowed to keep their lands on the condition of loyalty. The arrival of Adalgis, with Greek reinforcements, triggered the revolt. Upon learning of Adalgis's plans from the Pope, Charlemagne hurried back to Italy. Only one noble, Duke Rotgund of Friuli, took up arms. He was quickly defeated, captured, and forced to spend the rest of his life doing penance. The other nobles were stripped of their lands, and the territory was reorganized into earldoms, governed by Frankish nobles. When the Saxons learned that Charlemagne was occupied in Italy, they broke their promises and rebelled once again. They destroyed several Christian churches and advanced to lay siege to Eresburg, a Frankish stronghold. Unable to capture it through direct assault, they resorted to deception. Pretending to retreat, they lured the Franks out of the fortress, then turned back, ambushed them, and destroyed the fortress. A few members of the garrison managed to escape to Siegburg on the Ruhr, but the Saxons were unsuccessful in capturing that location. Charlemagne, having returned from Italy, suddenly appeared in Saxony and crushed the Saxon resistance. Once again, he forgave those who pleaded for mercy, rebuilt Eresburg, and constructed a new fortress at Lippstadt. To make peace with Charlemagne, several Saxon nobles, including Bruno, Witikind's son-in-law, accepted Christian baptism and remained as hostages with the king. Charlemagne did not punish these hostages for their previous betrayal. Instead, he continued to favor a more lenient approach, which did not fully satisfy his advisors. Charlemagne believed that it was not yet the right time to forcefully convert the Saxons to Christianity, convinced that genuine belief could not be imposed through violence. While he was determined to Christianize the Saxons, he preferred using less aggressive methods. He also aimed to integrate the Saxons into a unified German nation, but he proceeded carefully, avoiding unnecessary actions. Charlemagne had a tradition of calling an annual assembly of his leaders at the Champ de Mai to discuss state affairs. In 727, he decided to hold this assembly in Saxony, choosing a location near the source of the Lippe River, close to Paderborn. He hoped the Saxons would see this meeting as a gesture of peace. The Saxon leaders were invited to attend, and they all came, except for Witikind, who harbored a deep hatred for the Franks. After their earlier defeat, Witikind had fled. Like Adalgis, who sought support from the Greek emperor, Witikind appealed to his brother-in-law Siegfried, the king of Denmark, for assistance. The Saxon chiefs saw Charlemagne for the first time in a setting of peace and authority. Surrounding his throne were military heroes and high-ranking church officials. Impressed by his presence, many of the Saxon chiefs willingly accepted him as their ruler. At the same time, a Moorish embassy from Spain arrived in Paderborn. The Saxons were amazed at the Moors' richly adorned clothing, so different from that of the northern peoples. The Moorish leaders had come to seek Charlemagne's help against Abderrahman, the Caliph of Cordova, and promised to pledge their loyalty to him if he freed them from the Caliph's control. Charlemagne welcomed the chance to get involved in Spanish affairs. He promised to support the Moors and, in return, demanded a district in northern Spain as a defensive buffer against the Moors in the south. For the first time, the Saxons realized the vast reach of Charlemagne's power and reputation. They wondered how they could continue to resist him. As Ozanam notes, many of them swore loyalty to Charlemagne and vowed to surrender their land and freedom if they broke their word. Many abandoned their pagan beliefs and were baptized. A large group of men, women, and children, dressed in white, went to the river with priests chanting hymns and returned as Christians. At the front were the priests and monks who laid the foundation of the Christian Saxon Church. The world celebrated their conversion. No one was more pleased than Charlemagne. His success boosted his hope and enthusiasm as he prepared for his Spanish campaign the following year. Crossing the Pyrenees, he conquered Pamplona and Barcelona, bringing Navarre, Aragon, and Catalonia under his control. He then laid siege to Zaragoza, and after a short resistance, its people surrendered, providing hostages and tribute. Charlemagne established northeastern Spain, up to the Ebro River, as the boundary of the Frankish kingdom in Spain, creating a buffer zone against the Moors to prevent further invasions and protect the Christian world, just as his grandfather had done. However, troubling news from home forced Charlemagne to leave Spain. While crossing back over the Pyrenees, a portion of his army faced a serious disaster. The rear guard, led by Roland, was ambushed in a narrow valley near Roncesvalles by the Basques and was completely wiped out. The Frankish forces could not resist because the enemy held a strong position on the heights, from which they rolled down massive boulders and rained down arrows and spears. The heroic Roland and his brave companions, the paladin Anselm and the seneschal Eckhart, were killed and later immortalized in songs and legends. Charlemagne would likely have turned back to avenge this loss, but news of another Saxon uprising forced him to return home quickly. He soon defeated the Saxons and devastated their land up to the Elbe River. As usual, Witikind fled, and the Saxons swore allegiance and provided hostages to ensure their loyalty. Charlemagne understood that the deep-seated hostility of the Saxons was rooted in their pagan beliefs. He decided to eliminate these beliefs by force. His plan was to pardon only those Saxons who agreed to be baptized and remain loyal to Christianity. Anyone who participated in pagan practices would be sentenced to death. While using force to change people's beliefs is undoubtedly wrong, Charlemagne saw this as the only way to prevent the constant uprisings. He believed it would also be beneficial in the long term, as the younger generation might become more loyal after abandoning their old religion. Charlemagne was determined not only to spread Christianity, but also to impose Frankish laws. He divided Saxony into districts, each overseen by a Frankish chief. He believed that strict measures were necessary to control people who had repeatedly broken their commitments. However, this approach led to a severe backlash. Under the leadership of Witikind and his brother Albion, the Saxons almost completely destroyed a division of the Frankish army and killed 4 princes and 20 prominent nobles. Charlemagne was overwhelmed with grief over this loss, but his anger toward the Saxons was even greater. His patience had run out. He decided that justice had to be uncompromising when dealing with those he considered murderers and traitors. He believed that if he did not punish them harshly, it would only encourage the Saxons to commit further atrocities. To prevent this, he resolved to impose a penalty so severe that it would deter the Saxons from rebelling again and protect those who might be at risk if the guilty were not punished. Charlemagne believed that a judge who frees a murderer is just as guilty if that murderer kills again. He quickly crushed the uprising, and when the Saxons, as usual, begged for mercy and blamed Witikind, who had fled once more, he demanded that the guilty be handed over. They were tried by a military court, found guilty, and executed, 4,500 in one day. This event is known as the Massacre of Verdun, a grim and horrifying deed. Chapter 5. The Birth of Austria. Despite their many defeats and the massacre at Verdun, the Saxons were not fully subdued. Outraged by the massacre, Witikind and the other Saxon leaders sparked another rebellion and launched a war of revenge. As a result, Charlemagne was forced to take even harsher measures. 2 intense battles followed, one at Detmold, which ended inconclusively, and another in Hesse, between the Ems and the Weser rivers, where the Saxons, who fought with extraordinary bravery, were decisively defeated. After this victory, Charlemagne relocated 10,000 Saxons, along with their women and children, to Brabant and Flanders, giving their former lands to Frankish settlers. Determined to end the Saxon resistance once and for all, Charlemagne decided to launch an offensive campaign. Up to that point, the Saxons had always initiated the conflicts, but in 784, Charlemagne invaded Saxony and pushed as far as the Elbe River. There, he learned that Witikind and Albion were on the opposite bank and were willing to negotiate. Charlemagne sent messengers offering them safe passage if they wished to meet him. Witikind responded that they were ready to swear loyalty and be baptized, and a meeting was arranged at Charlemagne's castle in Attigny. When Witikind and Albion arrived, they were received with such kindness by Charlemagne that it softened the difficult decision they had been forced to make. The reconciliation between Charlemagne and Witikind proved that Charlemagne's approach to the Saxons was justified. Standing in the presence of the great king, Witikind, deeply moved by Charlemagne's majesty and graciousness, understood that if he had been in Charlemagne's position, he would have acted the same way. After this meeting at Attigny, those who had criticized Charlemagne seemed small-minded, unable to see beyond his military actions to recognize the greatness in his character. Witikind and Albion pledged loyalty to Charlemagne on behalf of themselves and their people, and were baptized along with many other Saxons. Geva, Witikind's wife, who had accompanied him, was also baptized. Charlemagne considered the day at Attigny one of the most fortunate of his life. He showered Witikind, Geva, and Albion with gifts, and sent them home under the protection of a guard of honor. He later wrote to the Pope, requesting a Thanksgiving celebration to commemorate the event. According to tradition, after Witikind was baptized, he later visited Charlemagne's castle in disguise during the Christmas festival. What he saw and heard there deeply moved him, erasing the last traces of his pagan beliefs and turning him into a true Christian. Charlemagne realized it was time to confront Tassilo, Duke of Bavaria, a challenge made more complicated by their close family ties. Tassilo was Pepin's nephew. Tassilo had not only been secretly conspiring against Charlemagne in Italy, but he was also in contact with the leaders of the Slavs and Thuringians, encouraging them to resist Charlemagne's rule. His most serious offense, however, was attempting to persuade the Avars to join in a war against Charlemagne. When Charlemagne learned of these intrigues in Italy, he arrived there much earlier than his enemies had expected, easily thwarting their plans. Afterward, he went to Rome to attend the Easter festival in 787. Fearing that Charlemagne would uncover all his secret plots, Tassilo sent messengers to the Pope, asking him to mediate a reconciliation with the king. However, the Pope, unsure whether Tassilo was sincere or just trying to buy time, refused his request. He warned Tassilo that if he broke his solemn promises or tried to evade them, he would be excommunicated. After returning from Italy, Charlemagne convened a parliament at Worms and presented Tassilo's case. Tassilo's refusal to attend only increased his guilt. As a result, war was declared against him. 3 Frankish armies invaded Bavaria. 2 were led by Charlemagne's sons, Karl and Pepin, and the third by Charlemagne himself. Tassilo was caught off guard, as he had planned to launch his operations later. None of his allies, the discontented Thuringians, the Slavs, or the Avars, came to his aid. His wife, Luitberger, the daughter of Desiderius, had repeatedly pushed him to go to war against Charlemagne. Realizing too late the folly of her advice and the danger they now faced, Tassilo found himself isolated. The Bavarians, meanwhile, were reluctant to fight and actually expressed more trust in Charlemagne than in their own duke. Facing such discouraging circumstances, Tassilo decided it was best to go to Charlemagne's camp and beg for his forgiveness. He showed deep remorse, surrendering his scepter to the king and admitting that he had forfeited his right to rule. In response, Charlemagne allowed Tassilo to keep his title of duke as a vassal, but took hostages to ensure his loyalty, including Tassilo's son, Theudo. Relieved to have avoided danger, Tassilo returned to Regensburg, and Charlemagne went back home. However, once Tassilo was again under his wife's influence, he quickly broke his promise and resumed his hostile actions. He gathered the leaders of his people in Regensburg, spoke out against Charlemagne, and boldly declared that he would not honor a forced promise, even if it cost him 10 sons. Tassilo's reckless behavior made him look dishonorable in the eyes of honest men. He reopened negotiations with the Avars and persuaded them to join him in an attack. One Avar army crossed through Bavaria into the Frankish kingdom, while another entered Italy, but both were defeated by Charlemagne's son, Karl. Justice finally caught up with Tassilo. He was summoned to appear before the parliament at Ingelheim. So demoralized by the defeat of the Avars, Tassilo did not dare to ignore the summons. He was unable to defend himself against charges of treason, and even his followers testified against him. The most serious charge was based on a Frankish law that stated, "Any individual who betrays the trust of the kingdom, violates their sworn oaths to the sovereign, or engages in alliances with adversaries of the realm, shall be deemed to have committed a capital offense, punishable by the forfeiture of their life." The court unanimously sentenced him to death. Charlemagne, however, asked Tassilo what he would do if his life were spared. In a show of repentance, Tassilo agreed to spend the rest of his life in a monastery. He received the tonsure at St. Goar and was then sent to Fulda. Charlemagne officially abolished Tassilo's ducal title, appointed Frankish counts to govern Bavaria, and fully integrated the region into the Frankish kingdom. The year 790 became notable for the Franks, as it was the only year of Charlemagne's reign marked by peace. However, preparations soon began for a new campaign against the Avars to prevent future raids. The Avars, who lived between the Enns and the Sava rivers, were descended from the Huns, which is why they are sometimes referred to as Huns in old chronicles. Like their ancestors, who had pillaged their way across Germany in the 5th century, the Avars were known for their raiding habits. They also inherited a vast amount of treasure, much of it stolen by their forebears. To protect their territory, the Avars built a unique type of defense, known as rings. These were large fortifications that enclosed several villages, consisting of strong walls about 10 feet high and wide, made of tree trunks and rocks, cemented together, and topped with thickly planted thorn bushes. The Avars believed these rings made them invulnerable to any enemy, but they would soon discover otherwise. Before launching his campaign against the Avars, Charlemagne reviewed his army in Regensburg. At this event, he ceremoniously gave his third son, Ludwig, a sword. Ludwig was just 13 years old and would take part in the expedition. Charlemagne advanced eastward along both banks of the Danube, while his son Pepin approached from Italy. The Avar Khan attacked Pepin but was defeated in a bloody battle. When Charlemagne reached the Enns River and heard of Pepin's victory, he immediately invaded the Avar territory. Several of their fortified rings were taken by storm. Their treasure vaults were emptied, villages were destroyed, and many prisoners were captured. However, an outbreak of disease among Charlemagne's horses forced him to retreat earlier than planned. The war continued for several more years before the Avars were fully defeated. The decisive battle occurred in 796. During this campaign, Pepin retook the rings he had previously captured and assaulted those still held by the Avars. One of the key Avar strongholds was Vienne, modern-day Vienna. Charlemagne annexed the Avar territory, making it the eastern border, Ostmark, of his kingdom, which later became known as Oesterreich and eventually Österreich, modern-day Austria. Chapter 6. The Shadow of God on Earth. Pope Hadrian died at the end of 795, and his passing deeply affected Charlemagne, who wept when he received the news. Hadrian had seen Charlemagne as the protector of the Church, and there was none of the ambition in their relationship that would later define interactions between popes and rulers, often to the detriment of Christianity. Leo III, who succeeded Hadrian, quickly sought to win Charlemagne's favor. He informed Charlemagne of his election and sent him a consecrated silver key, symbolizing Leo's acknowledgement of Charlemagne's authority over Roman lands and his status as a world ruler. Understanding the relationship between Charlemagne and the popes is essential, as it differed greatly from the dynamics between later popes and German rulers. In a congratulatory letter to Leo, Charlemagne expressed his support, saying, "We have thoroughly examined the contents of your letter and carefully considered the decrees you have put forth. It brings us great joy and satisfaction to extend our heartfelt congratulations on your unanimous election to the papacy. We are particularly impressed by the unwavering obedience demonstrated by your people, which speaks volumes about your leadership qualities. Furthermore, we deeply appreciate and acknowledge your sincere promises of loyalty to us, which we believe will serve as a strong foundation for our future collaboration in matters of both spiritual and temporal significance." Over the next few years, Charlemagne dealt with minor uprisings in Saxony and Spain. Although Wittekind and Albion remained loyal to their promises, some Saxons did not. But these disturbances were quickly subdued. In Spain, the Moors briefly gained some ground, but Charlemagne swiftly regained control. In 799, Pope Leo was attacked during a street procession. The mob had intended to blind him and cut out his tongue, but only managed to wound his face. His friends rescued him, and he found refuge. Two clerics, Pascal and Campulus, relatives of Pope Hadrian, were supposed to assist Leo during the procession, but they were actually behind the attack. When the Duke of Spoleto heard of the assault, he marched to Rome with his men and escorted Leo to safety in one of his castles. Once Leo recovered, he traveled to Germany to ask Charlemagne for help. When he reached Nuremberg, he learned Charlemagne was holding court in Paderborn and made his way there. Upon hearing of Leo's approach, Charlemagne made plans for a grand reception. He sent Archbishop Hildebrand and Count Auchar to meet the Pope, and as Leo neared the city, a cavalry unit went out to escort him. Charlemagne's son, Pepin, welcomed him and led him to the plaza, where Charlemagne sat in royal splendor, surrounded by his dignitaries. Rising to greet Leo, Charlemagne embraced him, took him by the hand, and led him as the Pope blessed the kneeling crowd. The next day, Pope Leo told Charlemagne about the plot against his life, showing him the scars on his face as evidence of the attack. He explained that the conspirators had tried to justify their actions by spreading malicious lies about him, and he asked for Charlemagne's help. Charlemagne replied that while he couldn't personally accompany the Pope to Rome, due to ongoing unrest in Saxony and Spain, he would send an escort led by Frankish chiefs and promised to travel to Rome himself as soon as possible. When Leo's enemies heard that Charlemagne had supported the Pope, they lost their nerve. Leo returned to Rome amid grand ceremonies, and Pascal and Campulus were imprisoned by the Franks. By the end of the following year, in 800, after resolving the issues in Saxony and Spain, Charlemagne kept his promise and journeyed to Rome. The Pope met him at Novante, where they had a private meeting, likely discussing the significant event that was soon to take place. The Pope then returned to Rome to prepare for Charlemagne's arrival. On December 6th, Charlemagne entered the city to a grand reception. The people greeted him with civic banners, cheers filled the air, and the Pope, surrounded by church dignitaries, welcomed him at the entrance of St. Peter's. Charlemagne entered the basilica to the sound of the papal choir, but this was only the beginning of the historic ceremony that had been quietly arranged. Charlemagne began his official duties in Rome by conducting an investigation into the attack on Pope Leo. The false accusations against the Pope were proven baseless, but Leo still wanted to personally clear his name. In response, Charlemagne gathered an assembly of clerical and secular leaders, inviting anyone with accusations against the Pope to come forward and present them. No one did. To clear himself of any wrongdoing, Pope Leo announced that he would take an oath to declare his innocence. He stood before the assembly and proclaimed, "With the gracious King Charlemagne and his prelates and princes present to investigate these charges, I, Leo, head of the Holy Roman Church, declare before God, his angels, and St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, that I am innocent of all accusations made against me." Afterward, Leo sentenced the conspirators to death, but Charlemagne later reduced the punishment. Pascal and Campulus were sent to a monastery for penance, and their allies were excommunicated. Finally, the historic event that made Charlemagne the ruler of the Christian world took place. On the first day of Christmas in the year 800, Pope Leo celebrated High Mass in the Vatican. Charlemagne, dressed in the elegant robes of a Roman patrician, knelt before the shrine of St. Peter. Suddenly, the Pope descended from the altar, placed a golden crown on Charlemagne's head, wrapped him in the imperial purple, and proclaimed in a loud voice, "Long life and success to the pious Charlemagne, sublime and peace-loving Roman Emperor." The choirs sang, and the crowd shouted, "Long live the divinely crowned Augustus Karl, great and pious Roman Emperor." The ceremony concluded with the anointing of Charlemagne as Roman Emperor and his son, Pepin, as King of Italy. The coronation of Charlemagne was an event of immense significance. It was far more than a mere spectacle or a staged ceremony by Pope Leo, as some historians have suggested. Charlemagne, a man of great physical and spiritual strength, would never have participated in something so hollow. He viewed the ceremony in the Vatican that day as profoundly important. It's unlikely that Pope Leo bestowed such an extraordinary honor on his protector, purely for personal gain. Charlemagne had consistently demonstrated his belief that he was called to use his power to strengthen and spread Christianity. At that time, less than a quarter of Europe had been converted to Christianity. The Christian world was under threat, from the south by the Muslims, from the north by the pagan Normans, and from the east by the Slavs and other non-Christians. For centuries, Eastern emperors had laid claim to Italy, leaving the Pope vulnerable until Pepin and Charlemagne came to his aid. Given these circumstances, it's understandable why Pope Leo declared Charlemagne, his savior, as the ultimate defender of Christendom. By bestowing this title, Leo created a symbol that commemorated Charlemagne's deeds and served to inspire all Christians. Charlemagne accepted the title not for vanity, but because it aligned with his greater mission. Although Charlemagne was known for his simple military attire, he understood the power of appearances in public life. He never underestimated the impact that titles and symbols had on the people, and the imperial crown carried great meaning. To him, it marked the fulfillment of his grand vision, a vision that transcended outward display. As Carrière aptly put it, Charlemagne built upon the achievements of his grandfather and father to create a grand historical legacy. His soul was filled with the ideal of a Roman Empire, united with a Christian German nation. From that moment on, he dedicated all his energy to uniting the Germanic peoples into a single, cohesive whole. He brought not only Bavaria, but also Saxony under German authority. His influence stretched from the Eider River to the Tiber, and from the Ebro to the Drava. When the Pope placed the imperial crown on his head, it symbolized the cultural and spiritual mission of the Germans in Rome, representing a Christian city that stood for God's kingdom on earth. Chapter 7. Fostering Enlightenment. It's almost hard to believe that a ruler like Charlemagne, who had to lead so many long and difficult military campaigns, 26 expeditions against the Saxons alone, could have had time to focus on anything else. One might wonder how he managed to find the time, energy, or even motivation for pursuits beyond warfare. The answer lies in the events that followed. While Charlemagne is often labeled a conqueror because of his military successes, his accomplishments in times of peace, and his ability to create lasting institutions prove that he was much more than a warrior. These achievements reveal his true vision of leadership and justify the title history has bestowed upon him. One key part of his life during the last 20 years was his favorite retreat, Aix-la-Chapelle, modern-day Aachen, where he spent most of his time when he wasn't on campaign. The area, with its gentle hills, part of the Eifel and Ardennes ranges, was densely forested and surrounded by a fertile valley. Although Charlemagne may not have been born there, as some claim, he certainly spent much of his childhood in this picturesque region. One of Charlemagne's favorite pastimes was bathing, and he often swam in the blue waters of the Rhine. But it was the warm mineral baths at Aix-la-Chapelle that he especially loved. The area's dense forests also drew him in, as he was an avid hunter even in his later years. His hunting parties often included his daughters, who would join him in chasing wild boars and buffaloes to the sound of horns and baying hounds. Figures like Charlemagne often capture the public's imagination, and stories and legends naturally spring up around them. One such legend centers on the baths at Aix-la-Chapelle, highlighting the emperor's deep connection to this beloved place and providing a glimpse into his character beyond his public achievements. At Charlemagne's palace in Mainz, there was a bell that was believed to ring whenever danger approached. One day, when Charlemagne heard it ringing, he sent a messenger to find out why. The messenger discovered a snake coiled around the bell's rope, acting as the bell ringer. The snake then led the messenger to its nest, where a toad was sitting on the snake's eggs. The messenger drove the toad away and reported the strange event to Charlemagne. What happened next was even more astonishing. The snake suddenly appeared in the hall, slithered to Charlemagne's table, climbed onto it, and dropped a sparkling jewel from its mouth into a wine glass before quickly disappearing. The stone, engraved with swan and runic symbols, was said to possess magical powers. Whoever received it would become the object of the giver's intense love. Charlemagne had the stone set into a ring and gave it to his beloved wife, Fastrada. From that moment, he felt an even deeper attachment to her and couldn't bear to be away from her. When Fastrada passed away, Charlemagne was devastated by grief. Her body was placed in an open coffin in the cathedral, and Charlemagne spent all his time there, refusing to allow her to be buried. The people began to worry, whispering among themselves, "The emperor's love for Fastrada has clouded his mind. What will happen to the kingdom if this continues?" In this dire situation, the pious Turpin had a dream that revealed a way to help the emperor. He got up, dressed, and hurried to the cathedral. Inside, he found the empress's sarcophagus near the altar, with the emperor weeping at her side, his head resting on the coffin. Surrounding the sarcophagus were paladins, dressed as penitents, lying on the floor in mourning. Turpin approached quietly, lifted the ermine cover from Fastrada's body, and gently took her cold hand, removing the ring. Instantly the spell was broken. The paladins, who had been deep in prayer, looked around in surprise. Charlemagne raised his head and spoke to them. "How long have we been consumed by our sorrow? It seems an eternity has passed, and yet the world continues to turn. Where is my chancellor? I hear the distant murmurs of our people, their needs unattended. The time has come for us to honor Fastrada's memory differently. Let us lay the empress to rest on the earth, where she may find peace, but let her spirit live on in our hearts and the prosperity of our kingdom. Her legacy shall not be one of unending grief, but of renewed purpose and dedication to our people." The magic swan ring began to influence Charlemagne in a new way. The emperor became deeply attached to the prelate who had removed the ring, and this troubled the prelate, knowing the ring's power. To break its hold, the prelate traveled to Aix-la-Chapelle, with Charlemagne following. Once there, he threw the ring into a tranquil forest lake formed by the warm springs. Unaware of this, Charlemagne developed a special affection for the place. He built a castle in the middle of the lake, where he often reflected on the fleeting nature of earthly life. The emperor also enjoyed bathing in the lake, never knowing that the swan ring now rested in its depths. At Aix-la-Chapelle, Charlemagne constructed a grand palace, surrounded by a broad colonnaded portico, an architectural marvel for its time. The columns, marble blocks, and mosaics were brought from Rome and Ravenna, and the best architects were sent by the Pope. Around the palace, buildings were constructed for schools, court attendants, and his bodyguards. Farther away, there was a cloister and farmhouses, and in the distance stood a tall structure over the warm baths that could accommodate hundreds of people. The most magnificent building of all was a minster, connected to the palace by a pillared walkway. The minster's dome, supported by tall columns, was adorned with a mosaic of Christ and the 24 elders of the Apocalypse, set against a gold background. The altars sparkled with gold and silver decorations. Everything was built according to Charlemagne's vision, and the work continued even when he was away on military campaigns. He dedicated himself deeply to spiritual matters. Early in the morning, he could often be seen walking along the portico to the church, where he meditated and prepared himself for the duties of the day. In the evening, he returned for similar contemplation and prayer. Charlemagne's companions in times of peace often followed him into battle. During his first Lombard campaign, he met Alcuin, a pious and learned Anglo-Saxon prelate. Charlemagne valued Alcuin's wisdom and teaching and brought him along for counsel. Like many princes of his time, Charlemagne had received only a modest education before assuming power. His natural intelligence helped him overcome challenges, but it also sparked in him a deep desire for knowledge. The great emperor became a dedicated student, sitting eagerly at the feet of his teacher, Alcuin, who is described by historian Guizot as follows. Alcuin was highly knowledgeable in the works of Antonius and Hieronymus, and well-versed in the teachings of Pythagoras, Aristotle, Aristippus, Diogenes, Plato, Homer, Virgil, Seneca, and Pliny. While most of his writings were theological, he also made significant contributions to mathematics, astronomy, dialectics, and rhetoric. He was a shining light of the church in his time and a scholar of the classics. Charlemagne's court was home to a circle of other scholars, including Angilbert, Eginhard, Theodulf, Peter of Pisa, and the Lombard historian Paulus Warnefried. Paulus, who had been sentenced to death for inciting rebellion in his homeland, was pardoned by Charlemagne and later honored by him. Charlemagne's deep appreciation for art and learning was evident in his active participation in the academic sessions of his court, where he was treated as an equal among scholars. He forbade courtly ceremonies in areas dedicated to intellectual pursuits, and to honor the cultural heritage of the past, he encouraged members of the Academy to adopt names of famous historical figures. Alcuin was known as Horace, Eginhard as Callippus, Angilbert as Homer, Theodulf as Pindar, and Charlemagne himself, as the hero and protector of the church, was affectionately called David. Charlemagne had remarkable natural linguistic abilities. Through his studies, which he continued both at home and on military campaigns, he quickly mastered Latin and spoke it fluently alongside his native language. He studied the great Roman historians, Julius Caesar, Sallust, Livy, and Tacitus, and, during his expeditions in Rome, saw firsthand the ruins and landmarks of their achievements. He also immersed himself in the world of ancient Greece, becoming proficient enough in Greek to read its literature in the original, which opened his eyes to the beauty and culture of that civilization. While he admired Rome, he held Athens in even higher regard. Yet, above both, he valued Jerusalem, the birthplace of the sacred teachings that he saw as the guiding light for humanity, much like the sun is to the earth. Charlemagne was steadfast in his faith and believed in the ultimate triumph of light and truth. He often expressed his dedication to the Academy and dreamed of creating a new Athens at Aix-la-Chapelle, a place that would embody Christian values and serve as a beacon of enlightenment for all nations. To realize this vision, he established training schools and youth academies. He even set up a court school for the sons of his generals and officials, overseeing every detail to ensure its success. Charlemagne wasn't ashamed to seek out expert knowledge and valued the insights education provided. One notable story from the Chronicles of St. Gall illustrates this. One day, Charlemagne noticed that the sons of the middle and lower classes had far exceeded his expectations, producing impressive work, while the sons of the nobility handed in poorly done, sloppy compositions. Following the example of a fair judge, Charlemagne placed the hard-working students on his right and said, "I commend you, my children, for your diligence in following my instructions and for doing your best. Keep striving to achieve even more so you can continue to meet my expectations and benefit from my care." Then, turning to those on his left, he scolded them with a stern gaze, saying, "Why is it that you, the sons of noblemen, born into privilege and wealth, have ignored my orders and disrespected my efforts to help you? You've wasted your time on frivolous activities, indulgence, and shameful behavior." Raising his arm in frustration, he shouted, "There are more important things in life than this. Your birth and rank mean little to me. Hear this. If you do not make up for your neglect with hard work, you will no longer enjoy my favor." Charlemagne knew that greatness could only be achieved by making the most of every moment. Even while getting dressed, he would handle state matters, hear grievances, hold meetings, and make decisions. When he couldn't sleep at night, he would spend his time reading and writing. Some might wonder why someone as educated as Charlemagne, fluent in Greek and Latin, and well-versed in classical literature, would still practice writing. This question has sparked much speculation. At that time, writing was not given much importance and was mostly reserved for copying religious texts or official documents. The books of that era, with their elaborate gold and silver covers adorned with precious gems, were considered true works of art. Historian Guizot explains, "With few books and even less paper, writing was both a luxury and a skill. Most learning was done orally, and writing was not typically used in the study. Though Charlemagne had no shortage of paper, his teachers were accustomed to instructing students through verbal lessons and memorized excerpts rather than written notes. They didn't expect detailed writing from their students and often completed their studies without focusing on what we consider a fundamental skill. The preparation of official documents and diplomas was left to expert scribes. Charlemagne's ability to write set him apart from the princes and nobility of his time, giving him another skill that exceeded those of his peers. During meals, Charlemagne ensured that the body wasn't the only thing being nourished. He also focused on enriching the mind. He enjoyed good conversation, and when discussions weren't engaging enough, his chaplain would read aloud from a worthy book. Charlemagne disliked overindulgence, so meals at his court were modest, consisting of just 4 courses, a rarity among royalty in those days. He drank only 3 times during meals and considered drunkenness a serious vice. He took great joy in being surrounded by his family, a pleasure he rarely had due to his many military campaigns. A particularly close relationship developed between Angilbert, who was known in the academic circle as Homer, and Charlemagne's daughter Bertha. On one occasion, the two were so absorbed in conversation that they didn't notice night falling. It's unclear how Charlemagne would have reacted had he known, but the hours flew by, and soon it was nearly dawn. Unlike a romantic morning, serenaded by larks and nightingales, it was a cold winter's day, with fresh snow covering the ground. Angilbert faced a problem. How could he leave without leaving footprints in the snow that might give him away? As fate would have it, Charlemagne rose early that morning, looked out the window, and saw his daughter Bertha carrying Angilbert on her back through the snow. She then quietly returned to her chamber. Charlemagne never mentioned the incident at the time, and only shared what he had witnessed much later. Charlemagne's deep faith inspired him to build the magnificent cathedral in Aix-la-Chapelle, where the music of Italian masters was heard for the first time. His chapel became a center for the art of song, and it was also the first time that the German language was used in church services, much to the surprise of the Franks. The organ that Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph of Baghdad, gifted to Charlemagne, made its debut there as well. According to the Chronicles of St. Gall, the organ was a marvel. This extraordinary instrument, powered by metal pipes and leather bellows, filled the air with resonant thunder one moment and soft lyre-like tones the next, as if it were magic. Wood, stone, music, candles, and incense alone don't hold much value in worship, and sometimes they can even distract from what truly matters, worshiping God in spirit and truth. Before Charlemagne's time, church services were filled with spectacle and ceremony. Churches often competed with each other over these displays, and this tendency hadn't changed much among the clergy or the congregation in his day. Once the clergy had completed their religious duties, they would often indulge in worldly pleasures, dressing in fine clothes, participating in hunts, military exercises, or attending banquets. Charlemagne was determined to reform these practices and set higher standards for the clergy, particularly in their behavior. He sought to eliminate greed, vanity, and the desire for personal grandeur among them. When one bishop flaunted a golden crozier encrusted with pearls and precious stones, Charlemagne sharply reprimanded him, saying, "Our pastors are called to bear the cross of Christ and shepherd their flock with humility and compassion. Yet, I observe with great disappointment that many have strayed from this sacred duty. Instead of tending to the spiritual needs of the poor and vulnerable, they engage in a misguided competition with kings and emperors, adorning themselves with worldly splendor. This pursuit of earthly riches and prestige not only distracts them from their holy calling, but also sets a poor example for those they are meant to guide. Let us remember that true wealth lies not in golden ornaments or jeweled vestments, but in the richness of a life devoted to serving God and His people." He also insisted on a spirit of reverence in all their actions. For example, when a young priest, highly recommended to Charlemagne, was assigned to an important position, the priest immediately mounted his horse and prepared to ride off to hunt. Charlemagne called him back and remarked, "I see you're far too energetic for a priest. It would be better for you to follow me as a soldier, since the kingdom of heaven is troubled by these storms of war." While some members of the clergy accompanied Charlemagne on his campaigns, it wasn't to fight, but to offer spiritual support when needed. He did, however, make exceptions for certain monks who were known for their charitable work and the transcription of important texts, allowing them to hunt on occasion. Charlemagne thought they could use the opportunity to strengthen themselves and gather animal skins for book covers, belts, and gloves. Charlemagne worked tirelessly for the betterment of both the church and the state. He held 2 annual assemblies, one focused on military matters, and the other on deliberating important issues. These gatherings covered a wide range of topics essential to the empire. Remarkably, Charlemagne presided over 42 synods, where matters of the church were regulated, and education was a frequent topic of discussion. Over his reign, he issued 477 edicts related to his famous capitularies, and another 674 political decrees. While many of these laws may not apply to modern times, it's important to judge them based on the context of his era. The true measure of his wisdom lies in how well his laws served the needs of his people, and by all accounts, they brought significant benefits to the empire. In these assemblies, when discussing the wisdom of great figures from history, Charlemagne sometimes felt a sense of doubt. On one such occasion he lamented, "Oh, how I wish I had 12 advisors as wise as Hieronymus and Augustine." To this, Alcuin responded, "Even the ruler of heaven and earth did not have such advisors, yet you long for 12 of them." Despite being weighed down by concerns when he went to bed, Charlemagne always awoke with renewed energy and a fresh sense of purpose. Unlike his predecessors, who had made Paris their primary residence, Charlemagne, who was German in both body and soul, left Paris for the banks of the Rhine. As mentioned earlier, he chose Aix-la-Chapelle as his main residence later in life, drawn to its location and atmosphere. Nothing escaped Charlemagne's attention. He was involved in every aspect of public administration, applying his exceptional creativity to every challenge. Whether sitting in majesty on his throne or working in the academy to promote knowledge and truth, Charlemagne's abilities shone. It's hard to pinpoint in which role he excelled most, as a military leader, lawgiver, judge, or teacher. Those who saw him in simple attire, overseeing the work on one of his royal estates, could easily have believed that Charlemagne fulfilled the role of a farmer just as perfectly as that of a king. Under Charlemagne's management, the royal estates became models of efficient farming and management. He paid attention to every detail, and his plans were always successful. Stewards were provided with lists of crops, herbs, fruit trees, and medicinal plants that were to be grown and maintained in the fields and gardens. He also ordered poultry, geese, and doves to be kept near the mills to ensure that any excess grain was put to good use. Charlemagne built fish ponds, set up beekeeping operations, planted vineyards, and introduced improved methods for making wine. Charlemagne's attention to agriculture wasn't just practical. He also had an eye for beauty and leisure. He arranged for the keeping of pheasants and peacocks and cultivated large flower gardens for pleasure. He employed gardeners, fishery managers, and beekeepers. He even had experts teach people how to make better butter and cheese. On both the royal estates and others, hunters were posted to control wolves, and they were required to deliver a set number of wolf skins each year or face penalties. Any surplus from the estates was sold, and detailed yearly accounts were kept. Charlemagne supervised his stewards closely, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Despite his great wealth, Charlemagne was far from greedy. His household was always well provisioned, but he ensured that surplus grain was sold at a price slightly below the market rate to benefit the public. His sense of order was meticulous, and he believed that disorder, whether in the state, the family, or intellectual life, would lead to chaos and failure. He lived not on extravagance, but on the abundance of his own carefully managed estates. When it came to industry and commerce, Charlemagne's many wars didn't hinder the empire's prosperity. They boosted demand for makers of arrows, helmets, swords, bows, and armor. Royal palaces employed blacksmiths, armorers, gold and silver smiths, shoemakers, tailors, millers, carpenters, masons, wheelwrights, builders, brass workers, tanners, soap makers, fowlers, potters, bakers, joiners, saddlers, net weavers, coopers, architects, glass blowers, parchment makers, painters, and dyers. After Charlemagne decreed that monks who struggled in their studies should contribute through manual labor, there was a surge in skilled craftsmanship among artisans at the royal palaces, monasteries, and cities. Ferdinand Falz, in Scenes in City Life, noted that under Charlemagne's reign, despite the ongoing wars, cities experienced remarkable economic prosperity. The Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt rivers were bustling with cargo ships, and at busy ports like Worms, Mainz, Cologne, Dorstadt, Maastricht, Ghent, and Bruges, or the harbors near the mouth of the Scheldt, activity was constant. Merchants from Strasbourg shipped goods down the Rhine to the sea, while the Frisians sent goods upriver to Worms. Charlemagne was thrilled by this growing commerce. The old, patched-up Roman city walls soon became too cramped for the expanding urban populations. Churches and noble estates spread into the suburbs, which eventually had to be enclosed by new walls. Charlemagne viewed order, both in managing the royal household and governing the empire, as essential to effective rule. He divided the empire into districts, each overseen by a competent official, tasked with enforcing the laws laid out in the capitularies. Special judges were sent out periodically to inspect these districts and report back to the emperor. Charlemagne regularly gathered leading landowners and high-ranking church officials to discuss the state of the empire, typically in May, which is where the term Mayfield for these meetings originated. Chapter 8. The End of the Emperor Who Shaped Europe. It's no surprise that the fame of such a powerful ruler as Charlemagne spread far and wide. His court was a meeting place for representatives from many nations. You could find the heathen Avar, with braided hair, the proud Count of Lombardy, dressed in silk and peacock feathers, the turbaned Arab, the fierce Saxon, the agile Anglo-Saxon, the Bavarian, and the Frank, mingling with white-robed priests, dark-cowled monks, and gowned Jews. Princes from Asia and Africa sought favor from the great Western Emperor, including Harun al-Rashid, the powerful Muslim caliph of Asia. Charlemagne had sent an embassy to Harun, who ruled from the splendid city of Baghdad, asking him to protect Western Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem. Harun kindly agreed and sent Charlemagne the banner of Jerusalem and the keys to the Holy Sepulchre as a symbol of Charlemagne's authority over the city. Harun also sent luxurious gifts: gold-embroidered silk, frankincense, balsam, spices, monkeys, and even an elephant. In return, Charlemagne sent Spanish horses, mules, Frisian robes in white, gray, sapphire, and multicolored patterns, and large hounds suited for hunting lions and tigers. Charlemagne also built a hospital in Jerusalem to care for Christian pilgrims. Ibrahim, the African prince who ruled over modern-day Mauritius, sent him a Libyan lion, a Numidian bear, Iberian steel, and Tyrian purple. Harun also gifted a brass water clock that marked the hours with brass balls falling onto a metal basin, producing a clear chime. At this time, Charlemagne was over 60 years old. His white hair and beard added to his commanding presence. His fourth wife had recently passed away, and Rome suggested he marry the Empress Irene of Greece. Charlemagne, unaware of Irene's later revealed villainy, considered the union not for personal reasons, but as a ruler thinking about the good of the Christian world and his people. He decided that such a marriage would be beneficial and began the process. However, Irene was soon overthrown and exiled to Lesbos, an event that, in hindsight, proved fortunate for Charlemagne. In 803, a peace agreement was reached with the Saxons at Sels on the Saal River. They agreed to accept Christianity and the incorporation of their land into the Frankish Empire in exchange for the restoration of their old rights and customs. This secured lasting peace between the Saxons and Charlemagne's empire. In 808, the aging Charlemagne once again took to the battlefield, this time leading an expedition against Gottfried, the King of Denmark, who had previously incited Saxon revolts. However, Charlemagne's goal wasn't to settle old scores, but to stop new attacks. The Obotrites, allies of the Franks, had been suddenly assaulted by Gottfried, and Danish ships had raided the German coast, committing acts of pillage and murder. After being pushed back by Karl, Charlemagne's eldest son, Gottfried retreated to a spot beyond the Schlei, where a defensive wall, known as the Danework, had been built. During this campaign, Charlemagne suffered a fall from his horse, causing his lance to fly from his hand and his sword to drop from his belt. Many saw this as a bad omen, but Charlemagne and Gottfried never actually faced each other in battle. Gottfried was eventually killed by one of his men, and his brother Hemming, who succeeded him, quickly sent a peace delegation to Charlemagne. A treaty was reached, with Denmark giving up any claims to territory south of the Eider River, which became the northern boundary of the Frankish Empire. Upon returning to Aix-la-Chapelle, Charlemagne fell ill for the first time in his life. He dismissed it as a mild fever and soon returned to his duties. But for the first time, his people began to realize that even the great emperor was mortal, and they began to wonder what would happen to the empire if he were to pass away. Of Charlemagne's 3 sons, Karl and Pepin had proven themselves in battle, with Karl being his father's favorite due to his resemblance to Charlemagne in both appearance and character. However, despite his fondness for Karl, Charlemagne had to face the reality that his youngest son, Ludwig, lacked the strength and qualifications needed to ensure the empire's future stability. Charlemagne's vast empire stretched from the Eider and Baltic in the north to the Tiber and Mediterranean in the south, from the Elbe and Raab in the east to the Ebro and the Atlantic in the west, rivaling the size and power of the Roman Empire during the reign of Caesar and Augustus. Charlemagne gave careful thought to his situation before deciding to summon an assembly of the kingdom's high-ranking officials from both the state and the church. His plan was to divide his empire among his sons. According to his vision, young Karl would inherit the central part of the Frankish Empire, including the dominant Germanic regions. Pepin would govern Italy, and Ludwig would be given lands that would later become the heart of France. Over time, the circle of people closest to Charlemagne grew smaller. His beloved mother, Bertha, had been dead for 20 years. She had been a remarkable woman, who even in her will left generous provisions of linen for poor weavers and spinners. Charlemagne had cared for her with deep filial love until the very end. The academy still boasted many great scholars, but no one could replace his wise teacher and dear friend, Alcuin, who had passed away around this time. In 810, Charlemagne's eldest daughter, Rotrud, died. Barely had he begun to recover from this loss when news came of Pepin's sudden death after a brief illness. Human plans, it seems, often amount to nothing more than dust blown away by the wind. Despite his profound grief, Charlemagne pressed on with his work, both in matters of state and within the academy. In his later years, he embarked on writing German grammar with great enthusiasm. Sadly, the work was never completed, and only a few fragments survive, including the names he created for the months and winds. More sorrow struck in 811 when Karl, Charlemagne's favorite son, died unexpectedly, much like Pepin before him. Though deeply affected, Charlemagne continued to fulfill his responsibilities. However, after this final loss, his face never brightened with a smile again. Now, the only surviving son was Ludwig, the one Charlemagne had always considered the least capable. The weight of concern for the future of his empire and dynasty must have weighed heavily on the emperor's heart. In 813, Charlemagne called together the empire's leading figures for an assembly at Aix-la-Chapelle. He informed them that he had successfully resolved border disputes with Greece, Denmark, and the Moors, which brought great relief and satisfaction to those present. Charlemagne then announced that he had chosen his son Ludwig to be king of the Franks, and sought their approval to also crown him Roman emperor. They agreed, but many of them were filled with sorrow, sensing the weight of the moment. On the day set for the coronation, Charlemagne arrived at the cathedral in full imperial attire, accompanied by the assembled nobles. He led Ludwig to the altar, where a throne awaited. After offering prayers, they rose, and Charlemagne delivered a solemn address to his son, reminding him of the responsibilities of leadership. He ended his speech with this counsel: "Use your strength to compel those who sow disorder and danger to live peacefully and follow the right path. Be a comfort and protector to the monasteries and the poor. Choose wise, just, and strong advisors, and only remove them for good reason. Above all, conduct yourself in such a way that you will not be ashamed before God or man." After Ludwig pledged to honor these principles, Charlemagne instructed him to take the crown from the altar and place it on his head. Ludwig did so. Charlemagne, though a devout supporter of the church, chose to have his son crown himself, to avoid giving the clergy too much authority in matters of state. With his son by his side, the aging emperor then left the cathedral and returned to the palace. Shortly afterward, Ludwig went to Aquitaine, the region assigned to him. The parting between father and son was a sorrowful one, as both knew in their hearts that they might never see each other again. The people were deeply troubled, especially after a strange event occurred that stirred their imaginations and led many to believe that disaster was imminent. A lightning strike hit the colonnade connecting the palace and the minster, damaging the dome and erasing the words Carolus Princeps from the altar. However, Charlemagne paid no attention to it. To him, it was of little significance. As the year 814 began, it became clear to all that the emperor was growing weaker. On January 27th, Bishop Hildebald administered the last rites, and early the next day, Charlemagne passed away at the age of 72, having reigned for 47 years. His final words were, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." The gravity of his passing was underscored by the debate over how to lay him to rest. Charlemagne had long been the guardian of the empire's well-being, its battle hero, its lawgiver, judge, counselor, and teacher among scholars. The thought of burying him in a traditional coffin seemed unfitting to those who mourned his loss. After much deliberation, they chose a form of burial that reflected his immense stature. Charlemagne was seated on a marble throne adorned with gold. He wore his imperial robes, decorated with golden bees. A crown rested on his head, and at his side were a sword and a pilgrim's scrip. A Bible was placed on his knees, and a fragment of the Holy Cross lay upon his chest. In this regal pose, he was lowered into the crypt of the minster, which was filled with the finest spices. 186 years later, in the year 1000, the German Emperor Otto III, who struggled with deep melancholy, decided to open Charlemagne's crypt, hoping that seeing the great emperor would bring him peace. In the glow of the torches, Charlemagne's majestic figure was revealed, still sitting upright on his throne. However, Otto did not find the rest he sought. Perhaps if he had truly understood Charlemagne's spirit and studied his remarkable achievements, it might have inspired him to better fulfill his own duties as a ruler. A century and a half later, the crypt was opened again by Emperor Barbarossa, who commanded that Charlemagne's remains be placed in a marble casket and reburied in the cathedral. As we reflect with reverence on the image of Charlemagne in his crypt, we should also consider his life's journey, as revealed through the story of his reign. If we do this with an open mind, resisting the influence of those who seek to tarnish the legacies of great men, we can be inspired by his accomplishments. In doing so, we can strive to make our own lives a source of blessing for ourselves and others.